I'm Adam Moz, and this is Moz Models. Welcome back to the next episode in our ETHOS for Spektrum users Maule 1.5 meter setup video series. Today, you'll notice that there's no radio on the screen. What we have here is the belly of the Maule, and there is the currently installed AR631 Spektrum receiver. And you can see it comes pre-wired, and right down here, you see that there's that Spektrum logo right there, and that is the bind button. So we are going, and I'm just going to position it a little bit better over here, we're going to get this bound up. And we're going to do it in stages. The first stage is the Spektrum setup. So we'll bind this in safe select mode on the NX8. This will be the shortest part of the video because this is pretty straightforward. I will be keeping the battery connections off screen just because I think everybody here at this point knows how to plug the battery in, and that's all you need to do from that perspective. So, without further ado, let us power on this aircraft. And if you heard that, and I'm pretty sure you did, that is everything powering on. I'm just going to reach in here with this, and I'm going to press that button, and now it's in bind mode. Now I'm going to move the aircraft so you can see the radio. Plus, this is Spektrum. It is always recommended with Spektrum that when you bind, you have the receiver around 2 meters, or 9 to 10 feet away from the radio to prevent any swamping issues from affecting the bind process. And we're back, and we've got the radio, and we're just going to power it on here. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that we can see the screen at just a touch better what I'm doing. Since we don't have two radios side by side, let's get a better view of what I'm doing. So I'm going to click once on the wheel. I'm going to scroll down here to System Setup. Click there. Select Yes. And here we are in the System Setup, and we're going to scroll down to Bind. I'm going to click there and go over it. The receiver's already in bind mode. Well, we're back with a successful bind. I had to lean the aircraft up against something and then move a couple meters away and hold the radio in the air to get it to bind. So I did use the button bind in this. So powered the receiver on, held the button, and then went in. So we are going, let's click in here. And we're going down to forward actually, we're going to go into channel assign first because I need to do one thing. I need to go to my AUX 3, and I'm just going to click here. And the reason for that is I want my safe on this button, so I hold it down for safe. And I want that on channel 8 because at some point I'm going to replace the ESC on this, and I want it set up so I can have reversing on channel 7, which is the default for the smart ESCs. If I revert this at the end to a Spektrum based setup, with smart ESC, I want it to be able to fly on all my radios with the same fundamental channel layout, which is going to be flaps on channel 6, throttle reversing on channel 7, safe on channel 8. Now, we're going to go to forward programming. And we're going to go into gyro settings and safe select. Safe select channel inhibit is right now, and it's AUX 3. And go down turn safe select on, and we'll go back out. And just in a little quick motion check, I need to go reverse this channel. Because right now, it's safe select on, and then when I press, it turns it off, and I want the opposite. So we're going to go over into servo setup, travel, click through, subtrim, reverse, and we're going to go and reverse AX3. So now, I get safe select. When I press that, you can just monitor this. I don't have the aircraft assembled, but you can just monitor this by watching the elevator servo. On the Maule, the elevator servo is external, it's in the tail, so you can just see exactly what it's doing. If it's moving, you've got safe select on. If it's not moving, then you've got safe select off. So we've gone and we've reversed that. And the base setup is now done. The only thing left for this to be flyable on Spektrum is making sure all your control surfaces are centered and that you've got, and we'll dial in the elevator trim for flaps, or the elevator flap compensation in the air when it actually flies. So now let's look at what we have to do on ETHOS and on FrSky to get this up and running. And it's a little bit more involved because we're going to set up a receiver from scratch. So in a moment, I'm going to take you through all the setup requirements for getting the Archer Plus, SR10 Plus, and yes, that's a couple of pluses, set up for this aircraft. So we can just drop it right in and do the final setup in the aircraft at that point. This is a 10-port, fully stabilized telemetry receiver, and we're going to be setting it up with stabilization, similar setup to what we're doing here. We've got our auto level on a momentary. We will have flight modes because we'll be able to disable the stabilization fully. That will be something that needs to be set up in flight while you're tuning your gains. Once you tune your gains, we can actually simplify the programming a lot, so it's always in stabilization mode, except when you, or always in rate stabilization mode, except when you put it into self-level mode. So without further ado, we are going to move over to the X18 and the SR10 Plus. And we're back with the X18, a 2S receiver pack. So we'll just be using this for setup, and the Archer SR10 Plus. Now I have connected the pre-wired header on the SR10 Plus, and we will be using that for the first step, which is to update the receiver. Now you've got 4 wires on here. The blue wire, this is your AN2. That is a 0 to 36 volt analog voltage input. You can use that for telemetry. And then we have the negative or ground, positive, and the S port or F bus signal wire here. And we're going to use these three connectors, and they are individual connectors. You can replace them with a standard servo connector if you want. Probably recommended if you're going to be hooking up a lot of stuff to it. But for now, we're just going to plug those in order onto the radio and go from there. So I'm going to turn the radio up, and we'll just adjust the focus so you can see what I'm doing. And you've got the S-port signal connector right there, and the end with the key is signal, so we're going to put the black one in first, and we're going to put the red, and finally we're going to put the signal in next to the key, and we're going to go back here, just make sure everything's in focus. And we're going to go to the System menu and File Manager. And I have all my firmware in a firmware folder. It's all organized. We're going to go down to Receivers. This is an Archer Plus. And there is the firmware for the 2 Archer Plus receivers that are currently available. I tapped it. In the contextual menu, you have 3 options here that are related to flashing. The first is flash external device. That's what we're going to do. That's for flashing over the physical S-port connector on the radio. Then there's flash RX by int OTA. That is an over-the-air update. Once you've got the receiver in the aircraft, you don't have to unwire it to update it. You can flash by internal OTA to flash a receiver that's bound to the internal module, or you can flash RX by ext OTA, which is if you're using an external module that supports OTA flashing, like the Twin module or the R9 Pro modules, then you can flash by external OTA. So we're going to flash external device, and it's resetting, and it's flashing, and this isn't the world's fastest process, so we'll come back when it's ready. And we're back. We've just finished with a successful flash, so I'm going to tap close, and I'm going to click return, and once more to get here. Now, let's disconnect the receiver from the radio, and we're good now to register it. So I'm just going to move the radio over to the side, so we've got a little bit more space here. Now, binding in FrSky land is a two-stage process. First, with Access, Tandem, and Twin, you register the receiver to the owner registration ID, and then you bind the receiver to a receiver slot on the model. Now, there's a couple of key things. The owner registration ID can be shared amongst all your radios. So I have the same owner registration ID on my X18 as on my X12, my X20, and my Twin X Lite. That means that I do not have to physically access the receiver when switching it between radios. The only portion of this entire process that requires you have the receiver out in front of you and be able to access that little button there is the registration process. Bind, if the receiver comes up and it cannot hear the radio and model ID it's bound to, it will automatically, if it hears another radio with the same registration ID, it will pop into bind mode. This makes swapping between radios super easy. I will show that in a future video near the tail end. And we'll get them all up and running on my Twin X Lite in incredibly few steps, because we'll have already done almost all the work on the X18. So we are going to go over to Model, an RF system. You can see my owner registration ID is there, and I just used the original default preloaded nonsense characters that came with my X20. So I've set my other radios to match what came with the X20. You can put a custom phrase in there if you want. So I'm going to go drop that down. We're using the internal module. I'm going to turn it on. It defaults to Access. You can go there and you can choose ACC D16, and that is version 2.1 firmware, not version 1. And then there's TD mode, which is your tandem dual band. So we're going to make sure we are on Access 2.4, internal. Now, model ID. This is your model match. By default, the first model you create when powering the radio is 0, and every additional model you create increases by 2. The problem is it resets every time you power cycle the radio, because it can't auto-populate, because Spektrum does have a patent on auto-populate or auto-generation. So we are going to go and pick a nice high number here. I'm going to pick 40. That's because I don't feel like going through and checking to see which ones I've used. I have not used 40. And we'll keep scrolling down. And you'll see the channel range is set channel 1 to 16 by default. You can set that 1 to 24. We have no need. We only need 16 channels. This is a stabilized receiver. You have to use 1 to 16 minimum, because your stabilization is controlled by channels 9, 10, 11, and 12 in normal mode, or 9, 10, and 12 in quick mode. We'll be using quick mode. So we are going to go back up that register button, and we're going to hit it. This puts the radio in registration mode, and now I'm going to take this little hard pin, and I'm going to hold that button down, and I'm going to plug in the receiver. And as soon as I can get that to go in, and you'll see it popped right up. It's called an SR10 Plus. My next SR10 Plus is going to be SR10 Plus space 2. UID is 0, so we're going to register it. Registration is okay. Now we have to do one other step before we put this in the aircraft. Normally, with a non-stabilized receiver, I'll go and I'll install it in the aircraft, and then I'll bind it. Once it's all installed, to power on the aircraft, and I'll bind it. However, there's another step that has to be done with the stabilized receivers. Unlike Spektrum, they do not come pre-calibrated. So we'll have to do the calibration. That has to be done on the bench, and that requires the receiver be bound to do so. So we're going to unplug it. We're going to go to RX1 here, and we're going to tap bind. And now we're just going to plug her in. You'll notice there it comes up, and this is the exact same experience you'd have if this was buried in the aircraft. You power it on, it doesn't hear a model ID that it's bound to. You do have to have the radio in bind mode. It will auto-populate there. And there we go, we're bind okay. Now we're going to go over to telemetry and get our sensors. So we set discover new sensors to on. It populates all of our sensors, and there's a whole bunch here because this is a stabilized receiver, and it does give gyro. There's an acceleration sensor for each of the 3 axes, and then a R angle and a P angle. And you can see these move as we move everything there. Plus your usual, you've got your receiver battery, 7.66 volts. I do need to recharge that receiver pack. Your VFR, your valid frame rate. ADC2, that's equivalent to AN2 here. On here, that's the blue wire. If we had a flight pack that we're monitoring, we'd be getting voltage there. RSSI tells you the receiver ID. First slot is 0, second slot is 1, third slot is 2. And then more of those. Now that we've got that, we're going to go over to device config, and we're going to pick SXR calibration. So it wants us to put the receiver horizontal and top side up. I'm just going to hold it firmly in that position, and we're going to click when done. And now it wants top side down. Click when done. Vertical, pins up. This one's always a pain. This one's going to go a little off because I'm putting it on the edge of my desk. So you can't see it, but because there's wires coming out of there, I've got it half on the desk in the orientation it wants. Calibrating. Now it wants pins down, so we're going to do the same thing. You can just see it. You can't quite see it, but again, I'm resting it on there, half off the table, so the battery pins aren't affected. Receiver legible, pins to the right. So that is, and if you can't see it here, but the lettering is upside down. Legible means label facing you, not label up. So there's a couple of receivers. This is one, the SR6 is another, where the label is going to be in the wrong orientation. And not legible, pins to the left, means back of the receiver, pins to the left. And that's the calibration step. That is the most annoying part of setting up an Archer SR. The next step is we need to give mixes for our Archer. So we'll be setting up 3 mixes. The first one, we'll go and add. This one's a free mix, and it's going into the last position, and we're going to call it gain. This is our gain control. And the source, I'm just going to click, and it doesn't want to click, so we're going to go to trims and T5. I really like using the trimmers because they remember the gain, so you don't constantly have to add it. Now, what we're going to do is a little weird thing. We're going to set an offset of 50%. 47, 48, 49, 50. And then we're going to drop the weight to 50%. And that's the weight up, and the weight down to 50%. What we're doing here is now, if you use the default mix, what you're going to have is you're going to have the midpoint is your zero gain, and either end of the adjuster is full 100% gain, which is way too much. The receiver will ignore a negative on the gain, but it wants to see that midpoint as it's zero and the max deflection as 100% gain. So now we're set up already. We're at 50% gain, and we've done changing the weights made the channel have half the throw. So instead of having 200 throw, minus 100 to 100, it's got only 100% throw. And then the 50% offset moves that up. So the midpoint, instead of being 0, is at 50. So now your bottom point is 0, and your top point is 100. And we've got a gain control that makes sense to a stabilizer. This is something you want to do with all of your gain setups that want that 0 to 100 adjuster for gain. Spektrum gains are pretty much the same way. They want 0 to 100. But since we're using a pre-configured Spektrum receiver in this example, we're not messing with the gains. They're already set up. And my experience is the Spektrum BNFs come out of the box with some nice gain setups. I've never been particularly tempted to change them. So we have our free mix set up. The next one is going to be our flight modes. This is going to be a free mix, and I'm going to call this one. So this is flight modes for the receiver, so just to be clear, I call this one stab mode. And the source in this case is SB. I always put my stabilization modes as well as any sort of modes for 3D or in gliders, my thermal, my cruise, always primarily on this switch right here. That's SB on FrSky. At least on this radio. This would be actually SA on my Twin X Lite because there's no switch here. And we're going to set the output, and then we're going to go fix the mistake I made. So this one is outputs to channel 10 because we're going to be doing quick mode. It tells me the channel doesn't have a name. Do you want to copy the mixer's name to the channel? Yes. So now the channel is called stab mode. So when you go into your outputs, you'll see what the channel does. And we forgot to do this on the gain channel. You'll notice here it says channels none. That's because I oopsed. So we'll go back here, scroll down, and for the Archer SR, gain is always on channel 9. That's the same for all of the receivers with stabilizers except for the new TD SR18 and the new RB25S and RB35S, where even in basic mode, because they've got 5 more stabilized channels than the older receivers or the SR10 Plus, they bumped everything up by 5 channels. So it's asking us if we want to name it. Yes. And there we go. And finally, we're going to put one last mix in its last position. And we're going to call this one Panic. And the source here is going to be my SF switch. And the output is going to be channel 12. And we'll name it again. And this is how I'm going to engage stabilization once everything is fully set up. So we now have full control for the quick mode setup. We have a gain control on this trimmer here. We have stabilization mode on this one, and that's something we're not going to use after we get the stabilization dialed in. We do have to adjust the gains and get everything working correctly first. And panic on my momentary here, that's the equivalent of putting panic or safe on the I button on the NX8. Now we'll go back, and we're going to go back into device config, and we're going to go into SXR, and we're going to change a couple things. First off, we're going to make sure SXR enable is on. That turns stabilization on. And we're going to scroll down. We're going to set AUX1 and AUX2 enabled to on. Now these two, this is a setting that confuses many. What AUX1 enabled does is decide whether channel 5 is a stabilized second aileron, specifically the right aileron, or a channel that can be used for something else. When AUX1 is enabled, it's a channel that can be used for something else. When AUX1 is disabled, it is a stabilized second aileron. Likewise for AUX2, that's your second elevator channel, your right elevator. And to be clear, the high channels are the right channels in FrSky. So AL2, it expects to be right. This pops up in a couple of spots where you have to be careful about it. The higher number channel always should be the right-hand channel. So we're also going to make sure we've got quick mode here, and that's on. So this is now set up the way we want, except we may need to adjust these inversions to get the control throws in the right direction. On FrSky, with the stabilized receivers, you've got to be careful about this. Most aircraft, you set up everything with stabilization turned off, then you enable stabilization and tweak the stabilization so that it matches the sticks. On FrSky, you do have to get the self-level direction right and then set your outputs on the transmitter so that the sticks match the self-level. The reason for this is the self-level is overwriting the controls it gets from the radio. So if you get everything set up correctly and you've got some channels reversed, and then you go in here and you invert the stabilization channel, it will invert the control signal it gets as well. So you have to go and undo that afterwards. My recommendation is always, don't worry about what the sticks are doing when you're dealing with an SXR, an Archer SR, or an Archer Plus SR Plus. Get the self-level direction working correctly first. Even if you're not going to use self-level, do that first, then get your sticks going in the correct direction. Something to be very careful with. Now, the next step here is we need to install this receiver, and for that, we're going to add a couple things. We got receiver tape and a pair of scissors to cut the receiver tape. And the last piece is some of the really good Scotch 600 transparent tape. This is overkill for this, but you can tape control surfaces on with this stuff, so I use it for everything. This is my go-to clear tape. I don't use the cheap Scotch tape. It's fine for installing antennas. It's not so fine for taping control surfaces and stuff like that. I don't like to have 2-3 tapes when I can use one for everything. It's not cheap, but it's not that expensive in context. So we're good to go here. The next thing we need to do is get this receiver into the radio, or into the model, not the radio. So we'll put the radio aside for now, and we'll get the airplane back. Okay, now we've got this the aircraft back on the bench. You'll notice we've got the old receiver there. And the first thing we're going to do is actually just pull the wires and plug them in the right spots. So we'll start throttle. That came out of port 1. And the Archer Pluses, you have to follow AETR. This is not like the regular receivers where you can use whatever mapping you want. These expect a specific mapping and you can't really change that. So throttle out of port 1 into port 3. Aileron, this is Y-cabled. So we're going to come out of port 1, or out of port 2 and into port 1. And it helps if I plug it in the right way. Also helps if my charger is... My charger's cycling a nickel metal hydride pack on the side, so it just finished a cycle. So that's why you're hearing that beeping. So we're plugged in the right way. Next up is elevator. And that goes into port 2. Next up is rudder, and that's port 4. And I'm just quickly referencing something. Radio, I put flaps on channel 5 or port 5. So we've got lights. We're going to do something a little differently. Port 9 is on the bottom here. So we're going to just turn this over and plug it in and signal to the middle on these for the two bottom ports. That's 9 and 10. We're going to use 10 actually to hook up the telemetry sensor. So I'm just going to see if I've got a spare cable lying around for that telemetry sensor. I don't right now. I will have to dig that out. I do intend to put a LiPo sensor on this. So there, we're hooked up. And there's a nice mess of cables. That means that in the future, we'll be able to set this aircraft up for full span ailerons, crow, and other stuff. We'll do that in an advanced video, sort of a sequel series where we do stuff like upgrade the ESC. This is a 40 amp non-telemetry ESC in this. This aircraft is notorious for pulling up to 60 amps on 4S. They rate it for 4S. They did not put enough ESC in it. You are riding on the ragged edge of what that ESC can do. And as such, you need to be a little careful. So the next piece we need to do here is just get that AR631 out of there. And this is glued in real well. And yes, I do mean glued in. So just a little bit of reefing on there, and it comes up. And there's glue, and there's a sticky pad. Now, one thing to be careful of with these is the Archer SRs expect to be pins aft. So again, there's a couple of spots where these are not the world's most configurable stabilizers. Pins aft is one of them. The other is your channel mapping. So I'm just putting some servo tape on here. And I know it's called servo tape, but the only thing I ever use it for, it seems, is installing receivers. I don't think I've ever successfully installed a servo with servo tape. Maybe in the car world, I don't know. Let's get that second one off there. So we need to turn this around. There's a nice little bump in there, which makes this a little bit more difficult to get in there. So we're just going to go and set this like that. No, that is, and you really do, anything with a gyro, you got to be particular just about how it's oriented, because if you're not particular, you will get weirdness. And you don't want weirdness with your gyro. So just push those out of the way. There we go. Pull this to the side because we're not using this yet. And the last thing I need to do is get these antennas installed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just tape one fore aft right here. And you always want your antennas at 90 degrees to each other. You also want one that is essentially parallel to your radio's, one of your radio antennas in the orientation you're most going to fly the airplane. So this thing's aerobatic, but I do tend to fly a lot of circuits, I'm the sort of guy who actually likes doing touch and goes and practicing my landings and flying the pattern. So this is going to fly a lot of patterns. So that fore and aft is going to put this parallel to the antenna, one of the antennas that is in my radio, which runs across the top of the screen. Because if your antenna is pointing at the receiver, or likewise at the radio, it's at its least effective. If it's parallel to the antenna, it's at its most effective. And then the other one, I'm going to just slide in here, and we're going to make this one just kind of go vertical right there. And I will be range checking these to make sure my antenna installation is good. I tend to do pretty well at this, but there's never any guarantees in life that what you think up on the bench actually works at the field. So always, always, always check your work with a range test. So there we go. And what we'll do now is we'll power this guy up and see how it behaves as soon as I look at where I put the battery. Okay, and we got good signal from and you can hear the motor power up. Now the next part is you really do want to do a self-check on this, because you don't necessarily get much leeway when a stabilization takes over and it drives your elevator, your ailerons to the stop. Oh, pardon me, I bumped that. Let's get that back so you can see it. So when you're stabilizing self-level and the aileron and elevator drives everything to the stop, you want to make sure it's got the right endpoints. The self-check process with the SXRs is how you do that, and we'll walk through that in a little bit. I do need to have the aircraft fully configured and all my throws set before I do my first self-check, or I can run into some problems. At this point, we're done for now. The next video is going to be the rest of the stabilization setup on the SR10. This is going to be the first video where there's not going to be much Spektrum content, because this is the pieces you need to do with the replacement receiver that you don't need to do with a pre-configured receiver in a bind and fly. This is a case where anytime you put in a new receiver, you're going to have to do something similar, particularly if it's a stabilizer. If you go and you put something like an Aura 8 in here with a serial receiver, which is a really nice setup if you want something highly agile, you're going to still have to go through and configure your stabilization, configure your endpoints. That's just part of the deal when you're setting up a new set of electronics in an existing aircraft. One of the beauties of bind and flies, you don't have to do all this. It all comes out of the box. If you are willing to live within the limitations of it all comes out of the box, and you get exactly what the engineer at Spektrum who did the flight testing thinks that the aircraft should do, and what specs Spektrum has decided that they want to give you around ESC, around telemetry, around stabilization. In this case, Spektrum, the R631, great stabilization. Limited telemetry, particularly without a Smart ESC, and it's short-range flyby telemetry, which is not what you get out of the SR10 Plus. The SR10 Plus is full telemetry. It supports external sensors, which we'll see in the next video. It supports full range, 2 kilometers plus a telemetry transmission versus 300 feet or so. It supports remote receivers. The R631 can be made to. It's not documented, but it is there. And it supports easier firmware updating. The R631 firmware updating is a bit of a pain, like all the Spektrum ones. You got to plug in a cable, unplug other stuff. You need to use a laptop to do the updating. There's no updating from the radio. And you have to register that receiver. So you can't go and update receivers for your buddy at the field unless you have their receiver registered to your account. So we will get into more of the advanced setup in the next video. At this point, we have the Archer Plus installed finally in the Maule. It's talking to the radio. It's got the servos installed correctly, plugged in correctly. The next step is getting this configured for the stabilization and for the channel throws to where we want. Okay, now thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.